It's really a pleasure to be here at the Franklin Society meeting. I want to thank you all for just such a great conference and at the Wistar Institute, and to be among the presence of such amazing women. It's just a treat, all morning long and all afternoon long. It's been a treat. So let me start by saying a little bit about myself and the topic that I'm going to cover. There we go. Here's the slide. So there we go. So I'm Seema Kumar. I grew up in India at a time where very few households actually had TV or a phone. We had to make international phone calls. We would go to what was called an STD booth. And you would go there and you have to book some time and go there and you put some coins in and you got maybe 5 minutes because that's all you could afford. That's what technology was like in India. But my father was a physicist and he taught me to love science. And he always used to say that science is the way that you will bring up your lot in life. And that science is what is going to get you to a better job and to a better career. And so I grew up loving science. And from my mother, I learned the art of storytelling. And so throughout my life, I've sort of converged in the interplay between science and storytelling. And I was also looking around me. I saw the status of women in India, and I began to write about it. And so while I was doing my studies in science, I would write as a hobby. And as I began writing, I began to get published, and it empowered me, to find my voice. And so I continued on writing and doing science, and I came to the United States to study science and journalism together, interdisciplinary studies. And so in science classes, I would sit there and I was the journalist trying to tell stories and saying, data and figures are great, but stories engage the heart. And then I would go into journalism class and I would say, you need to be able to tell stories about science. And so I found myself always in the convergence of these two worlds. And I found that there was strength in being different. At first, I used to walk in and I'm the only woman in the room, or I'm the only Indian in the room. And it's kind of intimidating to walk into a room full of people who don't look like you. But then I found that there is actually power in being different, and strength in being different, and payoffs in taking risks. So this was the foundation of my personal vision. And so in that convergence, I was at University of Maryland, and I had an internship at the National Cancer Institute doing science writing for the Journal of the National Cancer Institute. And they told me, your first assignment is to write a 500-word story for the journal, and we want you to go cover a press conference. It is being held this was at NIH, at the National Cancer Institute, by the Office of Human Genome Research. And James Watson is going to be announcing something. And I went to the press conference. I was standing there in a full standing up only room, at the back of the room, and there was Jim Watson. He said, we are going to sequence the human genome. And he said, it's 3 billion base pairs. So if you say $1 per base pair, that's 3 billion, and we're going to sequence it in 10 years. So 3 billion, 10-year project. And I just sort of stood there, this young intern, awestruck by this. And I went off and wrote a story. And that sort of DNA and the discovery of DNA and the story of the human genome was something that I covered for a very, very, very long time. And 10 years later was actually at the Whitehead Institute leading the communications and policy around the sequencing of the Human Genome Project, working with Eric Lander, published in Nature. It was also published in Science, of course, but I was on the Nature side with the public project. And so there, recently I was in Cambridge, and all of a sudden I ran into Jim Watson. There he was outside of the Eagle Pub, would you imagine? And the thing that I didn't know at that time as a young girl was the role of Rosalind Franklin and Photo 51 and the work that she had done. And I discovered all of that because all through my childhood and all, I had only learned about Watson and Crick. And so that sort of brought home the fact to me that there were hidden figures in the world of science who remained to be discovered and whose stories had not been told yet. So we know this, technology, science and technology has just transformed our world. We heard about it a lot this morning, from vaccines and antibiotics to robotics to gene editing to gene therapy to the iPhone. We talked about that. It has transformed our whole world. Just for me, in my own personal life, and I'm not that old, from growing up in a place where there was no TV and no telephone to now having all of this technology, my own personal life has changed. But the image and stories of science have not yet transformed. We still have the image of science, which is, Frankenstein, and then you have these, they're either Frankensteins, they're nerds, or they're stale, pale males. That's the image of science that we have. And science, there is a lore about science, and there's been storytelling about science in the past. And the storytelling is typically like this. People may not remember a lot about the science behind these stories, but they remember the stories. Eureka, and that was Archimedes jumping into the bathtub, displacing the water. Newton, I don't know if he was actually smoking a cigar or not, but this is, one of those pictures I found on the web, sitting under the apple tree, and the apple falls on his, and lo and behold, he discovers gravity. And then you have, Einstein and stories of Einstein, and of course the Eagle Pub and the famous Watson and Crick. We've discovered the secret of life, right? These are all the stories that get told, and this is what people remember. I mean, not us scientists, or we may know more details, but the whole world, and the world that is involved in the funding of science, in the policy making of science, does not know this. What they remember science by are the stories. Johnson & Johnson has a long history of supporting women. So in 8 out of 15 women who were the first 15 employees when the company was founded, I should say, in 1886, were women. We hired our first woman scientist in 1908, when fewer than 3% of the women went to college. She decided that she was not going to marry. She was a graduate from University of Minnesota, decided to travel halfway across the country and come to Johnson & Johnson in New Brunswick and work there. And so she was our first woman scientist, Edith. And so today women make up about half of our workforce. 43% of our management positions are women. We want to get to 50. We're at 43, and we continue to push for the 50. We want to push for 50 by 2020. And we support women in science at Johnson & Johnson through robust programs like We STEM 2D. What that is women in STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. 2 means the 2 actually should be mathematics, but it's also manufacturing and design, because we have a lot of manufacturing facilities, and there are many engineers who work in our manufacturing facilities, and design as well. We have women who are working in design. And so one of the things that we have done, we've heard a lot about the policies and the procedures and the workplace processes, systems that you have to have in place to encourage women to enter STEM careers. And we've been trying to work hard at it. So in academic research collaborations, we're committed to participation of women in 100% of our collaborations. If we get an approach for collaboration from a university or an academic professor or an academic institution, if there are no women who are in part of the proposal, then we will send it back. We're not willing to collaborate unless there are women as part of the collaboration. Our goal is to inspire 1 million girls, K through 12, to pursue STEM 2D careers by 2020. We have a mentorship program. We've achieved about 50% external hiring of women at manager levels in 2016, and $1 billion annually we spend on women-owned businesses, ranked top 5, and providing education and access to 16 million women and children. And some of the key things, we've talked about how important some of these factors are. Parental leave and how important that is. So it's at least 8 weeks. That's the least minimum of 8 weeks of parental leave, both for the husband and the wife, or I should say spouse, 2 parents around the globe. And then For no cost, employee moms can get special service to ship breast milk home when they're traveling for work. We have financial assistance for US employees for fertility treatments, and many, many, many more. So flexible work environment, all of the others, right? So we talked, I think, this afternoon about what it takes from a policy perspective, from a systems perspective, to implement the kind of work environment and change in order to facilitate more women into STEM careers. And yes, that helps. But at the end of the day, I think the culture needs to change, but also storytelling is just as important. So the imperative for us, I think we sort of began to think about the narratives that are talked about in the public, but also within Johnson & Johnson and elsewhere. We want to be able to show that we change the narrative of diversity and inclusion in science. And what we want to do is actually use the power of storytelling to actually change the culture and change the narrative. And there is the Native American proverb that says, tell me the facts and I'll learn. Tell me the truth and I'll believe. But tell me a story and it will live in my heart forever. There's something very, very, very powerful about storytelling that I think just sort of imprints some concepts in the brain. And I think we want to use that to empower women, empower the storytelling of women in science. So what is the power of storytelling? I think we saw already a reference to Hidden Figures. It's one of my favorite movies. And this had come out right before, two or 3 years ago, right before I was at the World Economic Forum in Davos. And we had this roundtable there at the Ordinary Club of Extraordinary Women, it's called. We get together every so often and talk about women and women in STEM and women in science. We talked about this movie, Hidden Figures. And we all said, what are we going to do about telling these sorts of stories? And we all committed to each writing 10 stories or telling 10 stories of women in science. And I'll come back to that later. But we talk about the power of storytelling. There is power in storytelling because as a result of this, and nobody thought, as you said, and that it would be that popular, right? It was a very popular movie. So what happened last week, right? NASA scientists win the Congressional Medal of Honor. All of them won the Congressional Medal of Honor. 2 of them alive, that's Catherine and Christine, are still alive. But of course, Mary and Dorothy got it posthumously. So a day late and a dollar short, as they say, but too little, too late, I don't know. But at the very least, I think the Hidden Figures came out of the shadows and were recognized by the Congressional Medal of Honor. So, the power of storytelling is quite large. We talked about facts about how many kids are graduating with STEM degrees, how many women are graduating with STEM degrees. And I think we focused a lot on the US, which makes sense. But what I think we may not know is that India has 600 million young people. More than half of its population is under 25. And half of the young people in the whole world will live in sub-Saharan Africa. So science has stereotypes. And one stereotype is what we've talked about, the gender stereotype. But the other is a diversity stereotype. When you think of Africa, not you, but when most people think of Africa, they think of, or at least the images that pop up, is poverty, disease, corruption. But that is just a perception, right? There is a lot of science happening in Africa. There is a lot of innovation happening in Africa. And young African millennials are changing the world for Africa, and similarly in India. And science, I think you had a similar slide. Science has an image problem, and here what I mean, in addition to science being nerdy and science being all about facts and figures, It's also science as an image problem because the moment you Google the word scientist, or Google images, you Google scientist, the typical image that comes up in stock photography is a stale, pale male, peering through a petri dish with, the safety glasses, and that's what comes up. Or you have the image of, the mad scientist who is either going to destroy the world or is discovering all these gadgets, right? So James Bond gets to be the debonair hero who gets to use all the technology, but Q is this very, very, nerdy scientist. So if you are a young person, do you want to be Q or do you want to be James Bond, right? And there, at least now, I think Q is looking somewhat like he is going to start a company, right? He looks like more like more like an entrepreneur. So we're making some progress, but what we wanted to do was really, we created a whole new movement around we call it champions of science, because this has to do with storytelling. Because what we figured at Johnson & Johnson is that we can put policies in place, we can do things in the workplace environment, we can, within the Johnson & Johnson world, we can try to do whatever we need to do and must do. But what about the whole ecosystem? How are we going to change the ecosystem? And that is, partly through advocacy and policy, but partly through storytelling. So we launched the Champions of Science program 2-3 years ago, and it has 3 pillars. People, we want to inspire the next generation through our programs, promoting inclusivity, entrepreneurship, talent, focus on kids and youth. And then we want to use the power of storytelling for scientist training and a stronger press corps, because we want science journalists to be telling these stories. And society, we want to build connections to everyday life. We want to spur entrepreneurship and cultivate advocates. So we've been working with a bunch of different organizations, AAAS, the New York Academy of Sciences, but also with an organization called Next Einstein Forum. The Next Einstein Forum is a movement which proposes that the next Einstein for this world is going to come from Africa. And so with the Next Einstein Forum, we've been working with African scientists, African entrepreneurs, and we've got a crowdsourcing program called the Africa Innovation Challenge, where we throw out a challenge in 5 categories or 6 categories or 3 categories. We've had 2 rounds so far, and this time around, we got about 800 odd submissions from all over the continent, so that's 54 different countries. And we ended up choosing 6 winners, and 6 winners in 6 categories with breakthrough ideas for solving problems that are close to home. So locally empowered youth, locally empowered scientists, looking at local issues and problems, local healthcare problems, local engineering problems, and coming up with solutions. So what we provide them is not only a cash prize to seed their idea, but also mentorship and also expertise from Johnson & Johnson. By the way, we have this sort of challenge we have all over the world, but I highlight Africa because we want to break the stereotypes that Africa does not have science or scientists. Similarly, what we've done is also launched a storytelling challenge. So as part of the storytelling challenge, we launched again, an Africa-wide challenge calling for stories from scientists from all over Africa. We got a number of different submissions, and we had 6 winners, but 6 winners who got a prize, but everybody's story is now published. So down the road, we hope to have a compendium of stories of science from Africa. We similarly have ongoing now a Latin American championship, and that one is actually ended, and we're going to be announcing the results in 2 weeks in Montevideo. So how many untold stories of women scientists are there? So as I mentioned to you at Davos, several of us made a commitment to continue writing stories about women in science. And so I blog regularly on LinkedIn about scientists whose stories have not been told. And similarly, many of our other colleagues write about science. And at Johnson & Johnson, in what we call our content lab on our website, we write stories of women in science. And our commitment is that we want to partner with everybody. And I invite everyone in this room to participate in the challenge. And that is to tell 1,000 stories of science in 2020 that change the societal expectations and perceptions of science. And so we can all be champions of science. We can all be champions of storytelling. And I know we're running short on time, so I tried to keep it short and flip through quickly. But I wanted to really make the point at the end of the day that, first of all, science is a noble profession, but it's filled with stereotype. It suffers still from an image problem, and I think that storytelling is an additional piece of additional muscle that we all can use, in addition to policy changes, in addition to advocacy, to change the nature and the status of women in science. So thank you all.